Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us. I can see folks are starting to trickle in. My name is Hannah Liu, and I'm a policy analyst for immigration and immigrant families at the Center for Law and Social Policy, otherwise known as CLASP. And I am so excited to welcome you to our annual Immigration Summit. For those that are new, Children at Risk is a research and advocacy nonprofit leading the way in improving the quality of life for Texas's children. Children at Risk considers the whole child by tracking issues in children's health, safety, education, and economic security. Committed to action beyond the data, Children at Risk drives evidence-based change by speaking out on behalf of children. You can view the agenda for today's program and get to know our featured experts using the links dropped in the chat. If you have questions, please submit those for our speakers using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your window. After the event, all registrants will receive the slide deck. Before we jump in, I'd like to take a moment to thank the folks that made today possible. First and foremost, let's give a shout out to our generous and engaged sponsors, HEB and CTAN. The Children Thrive Action Network, or CTAN, is a network of advocates and service providers at the national, state, and local levels who work directly with or on behalf of children and immigrant families. CTAN's mission is to defend and support children of immigrants in the United States. If your organization is interested in joining, the sign-up form will be dropped in the chat. And last but never least, we can't forget to recognize our community partners, the Texas Family Leadership Council, the Texas Racial Equity Collaborative, CLASP, Diversified Consulting, the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, the New York Immigration Coalition, ImSchools, and American Families United for your continued partnership in our immigration work over the years. None of us can do this alone, so thank you all for attending the summit as well. Today, we're going to learn how we can collaborate and build power to rise up to the challenges and seize opportunities in this upcoming year. So without further ado, let's move on to today's scheduled programming. We're going to start with a look into the data landscape and the state of immigrant children and families in the U.S. As a reminder, registrants will receive a copy of the slides shared today. Delivering this presentation is Senior Associate Director for the Center of Social Measurement and Evaluation with Children at Risk, Christine Thomas. Christine, will you join me on camera and please take it away?
Thank you, Hannah. All right, so yeah, today I am going to talk, if we can go to the next slide, children of immigrants in the U.S. And we'll just be talking about key socio-demographic characteristics. We go to the next slide. We're going to talk about how this information can help to define who children of immigrants are, their ethnic, racial diversity, as well as socioeconomic characteristics of their parents, so that we can better understand how to advance policies that can better support their ability to thrive. Next slide. We're going to talk about some operational definitions, just so we're all on the same page here and who we're talking about in this presentation. So newcomer children are a population of immigrant children and youth who were born outside of the U.S. and have recently arrived in this country, so less than 3 years. This includes unaccompanied children and other asylum-seeking children. Immigrant children are children who were born outside of the U.S., have less than 3 full academic years of attendance in U.S. schools. It's more important for education policies and programs. Today we'll be talking about children of immigrants, so children who have one or more parents who were born outside of the U.S. and regardless of where the child was born. Go to the next, thank you. So children of immigrants have become a significant part of the U.S. population. So it makes up about a quarter of the population as of 2016. Most recent data in 2022 shows that 26% of children, of all children ages 0 through 17 in the United States, are children of immigrants. And the vast majority of these children are actually U.S. citizens. So the interaction of factors such as national origin, race, family, SES, immigration status, and in shaping the outcomes is really not fully understood due to conceptual and data limitations. Next slide, thanks. So it's important to remember that children of immigrants are a racially diverse population. Their families come from all over the world. U.S. immigration is influenced by changes of immigration policy, global events, and a shift towards family reunification. Next slide. So the majority of children of immigrants in the US lived in mixed status families, meaning that everyone in the family might not have the same immigration status. So 5.2 million children, which 85% of those children are actually US citizens, have at least one parent who is undocumented. 728,000 children under the age of 18 are undocumented themselves. More than 250,000 of US citizen children have parents who have DACA status, so deferred action for childhood arrivals. More than 360,000 US children have parents with a temporary protected status, and about 113,500 unaccompanied children are released to sponsors in the US just this year. So many of those are also part of mixed status family. So having a US born parent can provide access to critical resources, even if a parent's not a US citizen. However, due to the federal welfare reform, some non-citizen immigrants, might not look for public benefits for their US citizen children due to fear of jeopardizing their own citizen prospects. So this data suggests that we should really look, service providing organizations should make special efforts to reach out to these mixed citizen status families. So I'm going to now talk about general demographics of immigrant families. So the U.S. is home to 93 different languages, with many children in immigrant families being potential bilingual speakers, which is a valuable asset in the global economic competition. However, English proficiency of parents is greatly influenced by children's language skills. So with children from families with limited English proficiency, they're more likely to struggle with English and be classified as an English language learner. So linguistically isolated households face new and serious challenges to supporting and participating in their children's education due to language barriers. So recent data from the KFF survey shows that 52% of immigrant parents do not speak English or don't speak it well, and 1 in 4 families report difficulty communicating with their child's school. Next slide. So immigrant family education. So according to new recent US Census data, recent immigrants in the United States are more likely to have a college education than earlier immigrants or US natives. So in 2022, among immigrants who arrived since 2010, 45% had a bachelor degree or higher compared to 38% of US natives, and 32% of earlier immigrants who arrived in the 1990s. So we're seeing a greater share of immigrants than US natives who have advanced degrees, such as master's degrees, professional degrees, and doctorates. So children of immigrants are a significant segment of the US child population. It's so critical that we incorporate these immigrant families within the US. So incorporations is really about the concern of the removal of institutional barriers for these immigrant groups, enabling full participation in the US society and equal access to opportunities, resources, rights, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or national origin. So while the majority of children of immigrants are US citizens, they're often harmed by policy that block access to critical supports to their immigrant parents, including those with lawful status, by making it harder for immigrant parents to access healthcare, nutrition assistance, and other critical supports. Their children, even though they have citizenship, often go without them. So immigrant students, including those with who are English language learners, may also require additional support. So schools should support their needs, and also the needs of immigrant students and families as required by law. So it's important to remember foreign-born students only make up 2% of the K through 12 population, and research shows that the presence of immigrant children in public schools benefits all children. Immigration is a children's issue, and we need immigration, education, health, and other intersecting policies that reflect the needs of children and family. Yeah, and if you want to learn more, please go on to the class website. They have a great blog. It's called Immigrant Access to Education. And you can learn more about immigrant access to education and how it's essential to America and good for all children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that informative and grounding presentation and for leaving us with more context for the conversations we're about to have. So, with immigration at the center of the political debate leading up to the presidential election this year, we are going to continue to see federal policies implemented and proposed that have direct consequences for immigrant children and families. In this next panel, experts will talk about both harmful and promising federal policies to keep an eye on and how advocates can get involved. Moderating this discussion on federal advocacy is Wendy Cervantes, Director of Immigration and Immigrant Families at CLASP. Wendy will be joined in this discussion by Heather Gonzalez, Vice President at American Families United, Ignacia Rodriguez Cometz, Senior Immigration Policy Associate with the National Immigration Law Center, or NILC, Jason Boyd, Vice President for Policy and Advocacy of Kids in Need of Defense, and Adriana Cadena, Campaign Director at Protecting Immigrant Families, or PIF. As a reminder, you can learn more about our guest speakers today using the link dropped in the chat. And with that, Wendy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Really appreciate that introduction. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so I'm just checking to see if I have my panelists with me, and it looks like I do. So great. Again, my name is Wendy Cervantes. I'm the Director of Immigration and Immigrant Families at CLASP, as well as a proud co-founder of the Children Thrive Action Network. I'm very excited to be moderating this year's federal policy conversation. We're so fortunate to have such a knowledgeable panel with us today to dig into the newest federal policy developments related to immigrant children and families. And I'm glad we have a little more time. So just this past Tuesday, the Biden administration announced a new policy that will provide undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens, as well as their undocumented children, work permits and a path to lawful permanent residency or a green card, as well as creating a more streamlined path to work visas and permanent relief for DACA recipients and other dreamers. A very big announcement. And this is also just a few weeks after the administration announced some very harmful policies that would make it harder for children and families seeking safety at our southern border to secure asylum. And as the political debate continues to heat up this election year, with immigration at the center, we can expect to see more troubling immigration policies on the table, as well as xenophobic, anti-immigrant rhetoric, all with direct consequences for children and families. There is no doubt that the stakes are very high for kids, and that's why it's essential that policymakers adopt a child-centered approach, and it is up to us as advocates, providers, and stakeholders to help make the case for why kids must come first. So today, our speakers will be talking about a range of topics, including the outlook this year for asylum-seeking children and families, administrative immigration relief options for mixed status families, including the program announced this week for spouses of U.S. citizens, as well as the urgent need to protect immigrant students' access to education and to remove long-standing barriers to healthcare and public benefits that undermine the ability of children in mixed status families to thrive. So I'm going to turn to our panel now, which Hannah has already introduced. And I'm going to pose one question to everyone to kick it off. And we'll start with Jason Boyd, Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at KIND. So Jason, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest threats facing immigrant children and or those in mixed status families in the current moment? And what are you most concerned or hopeful about following the 2024 election?
Thanks so much, Wendy. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. And I want to start by highlighting an immediate threat to immigrant children, one that, Wendy, you already referenced. Many of you are familiar with the recent proclamation that for the foreseeable future effectively precludes asylum for families and adults arriving to the U.S.-Mexico border between ports of entries. Now, that proclamation rightfully exempts unaccompanied children, consistent with bipartisan statute and those children's particular vulnerabilities. KIND applauds that exemption. Unfortunately, the proclamation as a whole will have the effect of rendering all too many children unaccompanied in the first place. That's because families shut out of asylum whose children's safety, even lives are at risk, may discern no meaningful choice but for their children to present alone at the border while the parents remain behind, a form of compelled family separation. We saw this under Remain in Mexico. We saw it under Title 42. We know the profound psychological harms attending a child's separation from loved ones. We also know the barriers that children face when attempting to navigate the adversarial complex U.S. immigration system alone. So this proclamation represents a direct threat to immigrant children's family unity, well-being, and access to safety. And as many of you know, a lawsuit is currently pending against it in federal court. I want to note that that proclamation, together with Remain in Mexico, Title 42, and other measures past and present, underscore a broader lesson that restrictionist immigration policies, not necessarily targeted at children, so often end up harming them. And that brings me to one of my biggest concerns post 2024 election. That regardless of election outcome, the US government could further lean into restrictionist measures that ensnare kids inadvertently or not. Over the past year plus, we've seen this administration and various members of Congress move towards certain positions, at least with regard to access to protection at the border, they not so long ago vigorously opposed. And I think there's a distinct risk, again, irrespective of election outcome, of a continued slide down that trajectory, and even a normalization of this kind of restrictionism with regard to access to protection at the border on a federal level at grave cost to vulnerable children. And that means that our advocacy on behalf of these kids will need to be even more responsive, agile, creative than ever before, that we are continually sharpening strategies for effectively engaging and resonating with the full array of audiences and perspectives. No small challenge, to be sure, but one that I think we'll need to embrace to ensure that kids receive the protections they need and deserve. And I'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Jason. I'm going to turn it over to Heather now with the same question, and also just give a huge shout out and thank you to American Families United for all of your hard work and helping to bring about the announcement earlier this week. But same question, what are some of the biggest threats from your perspective facing immigrant children or those in mixed status families in the current moment? And what are you most concerned or hopeful about following the 2024 election?
Yeah, first off, thank you for having me. The biggest threats that as a parent, having children in a mixed status family, is the unnecessary anxiety and depression that comes alongside having a parent who is undocumented. And our children go to school every single day, and they're not quite sure if their mom or dad is going to be home to cook dinner for them that night because they could be picked up and deported. So that mental state that is kind of pushed onto our children is absolutely unnecessary when there's such an easy fix to helping our children out and helping our families stay together and relieve them of that anxiety. As far as the 2024 election, as we know, obviously that was just an executive order on Tuesday. So if we don't get the election outcome that we need, that executive order is going away and we're back to square one. So it's very important that not only do we get the current administration back into office, but we still continue to work with the administration to provide that relief for the spouses and allow our children to have a whole family. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, we're going to move now over to Ignacia. Same question with a focus on access to education. Thanks, Ignacia.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's actually two threats that I would want to highlight for folks to be aware of. So the first one is to DACA. Currently, DACA recipients, if they have DACA, they can continue to renew it as long as it hasn't expired over a year ago. And there's still the access to advanced parole as well. But unfortunately, initial requests, first-time requests for DACA recipients can't be processed, and that's due to an order from Texas Judge Haynen. But the US v. Texas case continues. It's making its way through the courts, and it's right now before the Fifth Circuit. Briefing has ended, so there's a possibility that the Fifth Circuit can issue a decision based on just the briefing or actually schedule a hearing. So we definitely need to be vigilant and see, because chances are whatever comes from the Fifth Circuit will likely be appealed and therefore could be before the Supreme Court even as early as fall of this year. But keep in mind that the Fifth Circuit and Supreme Court can move faster or slower. There's also the possibility that the Supreme Court chooses not to hear the case, and then we're left whatever is decided by the Fifth Circuit. So some working assumptions to help our planning since the timeline is a bit fuzzy. We expect that there could be an unfavorable decision just because of the conservative leaning stance of both courts. And there could be like a winding down of the program, meaning that people who currently have DACA and their work permits can have them until expiration. But it's really unclear what could happen, and so we just need to prepare for these possible scenarios. And ultimately, we hope that between now and then there's some kind of relief available, whether administratively provided or through Congress, that will help these individuals. But that is largely determinative of what happens in November. Then there's Plyler. So over 40 years ago in 1982, the US Supreme Court ruled that there could be access to a public K through 12 education to students, regardless of immigration status, in the landmark case of Plyler v. Doe. But there were concerns that really came about once there was changes to the right to an abortion, once SCOTUS was willing to undo longstanding precedent. There were statements made, for example, by Governor Abbott in Texas that it's time to reevaluate Plyler. And since then, we've seen things like mention of Plyler in Heritage Foundation's report and in congressional hearings. And so we just need to stay, again, vigilant to see what could happen. We don't know if the threats will materialize, and if they materialize, in what form. It could be, for example, what we saw in Texas and Utah with bans on enrollment, which actually failed. It could be the collection of data on the cost of serving immigrants. It could even be unnecessary questions or document requests for enrollment. So it's just important for all of us to stay in communication, to stay in shared spaces such as CTAN, to be able to then share and troubleshoot and take some action when these threats do materialize.
Thank you, Ignacia. Two very timely updates. Appreciate that. We're going to turn it over to Adriana Cadena now, the campaign director for the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition. For anyone who just joined, I'm going to repeat the question one more time. So Adriana, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest threats facing immigrant children and or those in mixed status families in the current moment? And what are you most concerned or hopeful about following the 2024 election?
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you, Children at Risk, for this opportunity to be here with all of these colleagues. It's so great to hear all of you speak. And I'm just like, yes, to everything you said. It's all threats, right? I think it's important to really, think about this in terms of both what we see at the border and what is happening and the implications that Jason laid out to destination cities and to families who are already here who are in mixed status. We know that 1/4 of children in the United States have an immigrant parent. So mixed status is such a reality, and that every single day families are being challenged in terms of how to meet the needs of the children they have. I think for me, what is some of the biggest challenges right now is one, economic hardship, that even though families in mixed status families, parents in mixed status families are working, they're not making enough to be able to make ends meet. Most immigrants have incomes of about 40,000. And so leading a lot of $40,000 a year, which means it create tremendous challenges in order to serve the needs of their children. The second is, as well, compounded with this, is the fact that there is a large number of, particularly a large number of immigrants who are limited English speakers. And so being able to have connections to services in their communities is difficult because of being LEP, limited English proficient. And so while there is, regulations in place that help to ensure that services are provided in particular language or information is available in other languages, is not always enforced. And so that in itself is a risk in terms of what actual opportunities parents have to meet the needs of their children. And then the third that I think it's most critical is the fear that exists in communities. And this is a fear that we see the constant impact on. In 2022, the Urban Institute released a study that found that 25% of people in mixed status in families did not use, or they actually avoided, healthcare and other social service programs because of immigration concerns. And so the idea that being able to access services could jeopardize your immigration status now or in the future is very real in communities, and it's really unfortunate. And this is propelled not just in terms of the experience that people see or having, but also in the narrative that our country is hearing right now. And so, there's a lot of work that needs to happen, that this broad narrative is penetrating into communities. And so a lot of work needs to happen in terms of being able to counteract that and ensure that the communities are receiving the right information so they can be able to utilize the services that are available to them. And so thinking ahead after the election, this idea or this perception that enforcement comes first and then relief programs is also, I think, and it has an impact in terms of the ability of families to really trust government and to really trust being able to access services. And so regardless whether we see, and regardless of who wins the election, I think that's going to be a constant challenge. And of course, if we see, an administration that creates additional fear, or we see an administration that, cuts services, that's only going to intensify. And so we as advocates are challenged not only to ensure that we're protecting families who are here, but also protecting children and families that are, recent arrivals. And so how we address that and how do we ensure we prioritize services for everyone is going to be challenging for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Adriana. There's clearly a lot of work to be done leading up to the election, but even after, regardless of what the outcome of the election is, we know that there are risks and opportunities in both scenarios. I just want to remind panelists, when you have a chance, please check out the Q&A, and if there's anything that you can provide an answer to in real time, that's great. And we might actually have some time to take some questions on camera as well, since we have a little extra time. We're going to move on to our next question, and we'll start again with Jason. And that question is, are there any opportunities this year that you see to advance positive federal policies, either through Congress or the administration, to support immigrant kids and or those in mixed status families? And how can advocates and providers help support such policy change?
There are absolutely opportunities this year to advance federal policies positively impacting unaccompanied children. I'll name two that are unfolding in real time, one relating to the border, the other to the immigration courts. So first, after years of advocacy by Kind and partners, DHS's Office of Health Security, which is operationally distinct from CBP, is now hiring licensed child welfare professionals that it intends to deploy to CBP border facilities in the near term as part of its nascent child well-being program. These professionals, who are expert in children's unique physical and psychological needs and challenges, stand to meaningfully strengthen the care and screening of migrant children held in CBP custody. CBP, for its part, welcomes this development, in part because it will enable its agents and officers to dedicate less time and resources to child welfare duties, more time and resources to law enforcement functions. There are both Republican and Democratic members of Congress supporting funding for this initiative. So KIND is thrilled by the momentum around this program. We applaud the Office of Health Security, and we will continue to advocate for DHS to expeditiously deploy these professionals and for Congress to robustly fund them. Turning now to the courts. Many of you know that the immigration court system is fundamentally designed for adults, not children. Throughout that system's history, it has failed to properly account for unaccompanied children's unique vulnerabilities, resulting in widespread due process deficiencies, as well as operational inefficiencies. To help change this, in November of last year, members of Congress introduced the Immigration Court Efficiency and Children's Court Act on a bipartisan, bicameral basis. Legislation that would mandate that EOR establish specialized children's dockets at immigration courts nationwide. Those dockets would be largely dedicated to unaccompanied children's cases, presided over by a uniquely trained corps of immigration judges, and governed by more child-appropriate procedures. The very next month, the Executive Office for Immigration Review issued administrative guidance affirming the establishment of what it calls juvenile dockets at immigration courts throughout the country. Dockets that echo, in key respects, the notion of specialized children's dockets contemplated in the Children's Court Act. This guidance amounts to a major breakthrough for kids. Again, one that advocates have been pushing for years. Faithfully instituted, juvenile dockets will substantially improve fairness and efficiency in unaccompanied children's cases. But of course, the issuance of this guidance doesn't mark the end of our advocacy. It's more like the end of the beginning. Now our focus turns to ensuring robust implementation, including by observing dockets all throughout the country to gauge practices on the ground. We also have our work cut out for us to ensure legal representation of kids who are appearing before these dockets. But we are deeply heartened by this very real progress towards a future in which unaccompanied children can truly receive a fair day in court. We applaud EOR for taking this important step. And I should just note to folks on the call, feel free to reach out to me for any additional information about either of these initiatives. And I'll turn it back to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Jason. Those are really amazing opportunities, and thanks for all your work to help bring them forth through the amazing work that KIND does. I'm going to turn it over to Heather now with the same question. Any opportunities this year to advance federal policies, maybe more through the administration or through Congress, to support kids in mixed status families, and how can folks on the call help support such change?
Yeah, obviously we have the executive order, but we're still actively working on the details of that executive order. We had a meeting with DHS today in order to kind of streamline and fine tune and get some of the nitty-gritty details that are needed to protect all of our members within American Families United. With that being said, we actually have two bills in the House. The first one is the American Families United Act, as well as the Dignity Act. The American Families United Act is exactly what it seems. It provides legislative relief for our families, which makes this a permanent solution and not something that can be revoked at the next presidential term. So that is something that's very important to us. We're still advocating for that. It is a bipartisan bill that is in the House, and we're actually actively looking to start the introduction in the Senate. The Dignity Act actually has the American Families United Act in it, but in order to keep it bipartisan, we introduced a lot of border security measures that kind of placate to the other side, if you will. So those are two very important bills that we're still still actively working on. Just because we have this executive order, our work's not finished. And there's still many families out there who might not be covered by this executive order, but will be covered by the American Families United Act. So we're just asking for people on this call to reach out to their congressperson, make sure that they're signed on to the American Families United Act, to the Dignity Act, and continue, supporting it legislatively. Thank you.
Heather, if you don't mind me asking one follow-up question. I know one of the policies you've been advocating for is also to help out parents who and others who have already been deported to be able to reunify with families here in the U.S. Was that something covered in this recent announcement, or something that you're still advocating for?
We're still advocating for it. In fact, it was number one on our list that we took to DHS today to make sure that we include those families that are separated. The American Families United Act also has a place for separated families as well as the Dignity Act, which includes that.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now we'll turn it over to Ignacia over at NILC. Same question. Any opportunities this year to advance positive federal policies, and how can folks on this call help?
Thank you, Wendy. So with Plyler, I want to share here about the Education for All campaign. It's over 30 national and state organizations that have committed to the campaign, working to defend the right to public education for every child, no matter who they are or where they were born. And so the goal is to build an infrastructure to plan ahead and be ready to respond to any threat. And so we encourage your organization to consider joining. The link should be in the chat. And a big thank you to those of you who have joined already. There's also opportunities at the state and local level. So we've seen for many years now, safe school laws and policies in places like California. Also plans for supporting immigrant students from early ed through college. We've seen that in Oregon. And we've even seen some multi-language learners' Bill of Rights, such as in Connecticut. And then as an advocate, I encourage us all to ask around. There's a lot of creative ideas out there. I recently learned from Berenice Oliva from Tennessee about the positive impact of having an immigration youth transition specialist, such as herself, on school grounds to be able to welcome newcomer students. And I learned from Karen Reyes, who's an educator in Texas, about her work with her local union, still providing Know Your Rights presentations, and really doing a great job in just providing proper information in her state that has a lot of misinformation that's circulating. On DACA, I encourage folks to join the Home is Here campaign. There's a website available. That's a space where a lot of groups coordinate to be able to defend DACA and provide the proper information and guidance as these cases make their way to the Supreme Court. There's, for example, guidance for practitioners, guidance for DACA recipients. They'll host field calls whenever there's a new DACA development. In that way, we're up to date on where the case is and what the current DACA program looks like. And then the exciting announcements this week are expected to help at least some DACA recipients, which is very exciting. So Heather and Wendy were able to share about the relief for U.S. citizen spouses and their children. But there's also the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State working together to facilitate the employment visa process, for example, by allowing people who are eligible for these types of visas to access inadmissibility waivers related to those highly skilled labor visas, to be able to do much of that process within the United States, lessening the time that they have to be outside of the United States. But all this is a work in progress. So I highly encourage you to look at the DHS website, state websites, follow American Families United, forward.us, President's Alliance for more information, including timing and implementation of these recent announcements. And then lastly, we continue to ask Congress and the administration to not lose sight of the millions of immigrants across the country who are still waiting for a permanent solution, and ask Congress specifically to pass a pathway to citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll turn it over again to Adriana to answer the same question about any opportunities in the coming year within Congress and the administration, and how folks on this call can can help engage.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. And great work everyone is doing. I also, which is one of the great things about being, talking at the end, get to ditto everyone's work. So I think for us, what's really important at the administrative level is to ensure that the coverage for DACA recipients in the ACA is fixed and completed. The administration, released in terms of being able to ensure that DACA recipients could enroll in the marketplace. And so for us, that means a lot is continuing to provide outreach, education, do some eligibility fixes that the administration still needs to do. And that would ensure that 100,000 people with DACA can actually, who are currently uninsured and are eligible for marketplace with subsidies, can actually get enrolled. And so that's extremely important and, very timely to do so at this moment. The second is the implementation of Section 1557 in the ACA. It's equally important. We just had a webinar last week in collaboration with the National Immigration Law Center, talking with the director of the Office of Civil Rights for Health and Human Services, to ensure that, not only is this new language in the Section 1557, that not only are we aware of what this language is, but also that it actually gets enforced and implemented. And it's extremely important because we know the language, as I mentioned earlier, is a huge barrier for parents. And this particular rule prohibits interpretation by children because, again, it creates an additional, burden on children who should not have to interpret for their parents. And so it does require that the medical professionals and medical institutions have interpreters available. The third item for us that's important is to encourage the administration to continue providing waivers, 1332 waivers in the ACA that would allow immigrants, regardless of their status, to access health coverage in their states through the marketplace. Again, this is an opportunity where we can not only extend coverage for children, but also for their parents, because we know when a parent is well, children thrive. And so that's extremely important for us. The third thing, or the fourth thing, I think I'm actually on now, is really working with the administration to modify the Medicaid application model form. So the Centers of Medicaid and Medicare provide a model form to states of the Medicaid application. And that application is model form, it still needs to be fixed so that it doesn't include or it doesn't ask for people's immigration status and social security numbers who are not applying, but are just simply live in the household. And so there's a real opportunity in order to encourage administration to make that shift so that when it gets shared with states, they can be encouraged to make that change in their states. And then thinking about legislatively, there's two opportunities that we think is, that we feel extremely important that we're working with CLASP and CTAN on, which are, one is the Lift Up Bar Act, which will remove the 5-year bar for legal permanent residents to access any kind of public benefit, federal public benefits. Essentially, it should be low-hanging fruit in terms of getting support from members of Congress. So we encourage everyone who is on this call today and this webinar to please support the work that we're doing. We have a sign-on letter on the PIF website that you can sign on to. We also, are doing meetings with our members of Congress about why this is important. And essentially, if we can remove the 5-year bar for legal permanent residents, it allows us and gives us an opportunity to really be able to increase access to federal programs for all immigrants, regardless of what their status is. And then finally, I also want to mention the HEAL Act, which is also a proposal in Congress that would essentially provide much needed health services to immigrants, regardless of the status, and also removes the 5-year bar for healthcare services. The National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum and the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice are anchoring this work, in which PIF and some of our colleagues here, like CLASP and CTAN, are collaborating on as well. And I think it's a place where, for us, all of this work is important. One, because having a work permit or simply being able to having a work permit is not enough improve the well-being and the lives of families. We need to ensure that they have access to support systems when they need them. We need to ensure that they have access to medical care, to social services, to food, to housing, and so we need to work on this hand in hand to so that our families are well taken care of and they can actually have the freedom to thrive. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And I just think it's really amazing how all of these issues are so interconnected. I mean, access to healthcare is important for everyone, in particular children. And as was highlighted earlier, even though most children in immigrant families are U.S. citizens, there is obviously a lot of challenges and barriers that have been created. The restrictions facing their parents mean that a lot of kids in those families don't have access to things like healthcare and nutrition supports. And then it's so important to be able to get connected to asylum as a child or to any kind of legal status, like for an unaccompanied child who's entering the U.S. to be able to access healthcare. It's important for undocumented parents to have access to status and access to employer-based health insurance, for example, and that benefits their kids. So at the end of the day, we know that if parents and families aren't doing well, their kids aren't doing well. And so all of these issues are really connected. So since we have a little extra time, I did want to ask, there's a couple of questions that have come in. Some have been answered in the Q&A already. One question that I always get that I would love to have folks weigh in on, whoever is willing to, is just this common misconception that we as a country just don't have the resources to take in all of these newcomers, in particular children, and especially in our schools. And just want to get folks' reaction to that and how you might respond to that misconception.
I'll take a quick stab at this. I think, as a country, and we have also been responsible for creating instabilities in other regions of the world. And we have a moral responsibility to address and to care for people who we've been responsible for displacing. And so we know, for instance, in Central America, since the 1980s and probably beyond, there's been there's been intervention of the United States, which has caused people to migrate. And now, along with climate change, which we are also, have a part in that as well as the rest of the world, that not only should our country, embrace our history of being welcoming and a place for immigrants wanting to have a better life, but we should also have an opportunity to care for the individuals who need it when they get here. According to the Benefits Data Trust, today more than $80 billion in food, financial aid, healthcare, and other assistance goes untapped. And so that is money that's already available for these types of services. So when immigrants come to fill jobs, when they come to seek refuge from violence, when they come to reunite with their families, we can embrace them, and there is sufficient resources in this country if we put our priorities right to be able to care for them. So I think for us, from our point of view, is that we gain more as a nation, and we gain more as human beings when we see people for their humanity, and when we care for those people, because then at the end of the day, we all win together. And we have to move away from this sense of scarcity and move away from this idea that there is not enough, because there is enough for all of us.
Thank you, Adriana. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I completely agree with Adriana, but we'll add that also our spring 2023 messaging research showed that there's strong support for education access for all, with increased support after exposing them to our messaging. And we found that it really helped to have the messengers be the ones with direct experiences in education, whether that be administrators or educators that can really share how we have been doing this as a country, we can continue doing this, and really share like all the benefits that come from having access to an education. They're really seen as like the trusted messengers to counter counter this rhetoric of there being scarcity. And then we will soon have new findings from another set of research that has been conducted this year with focus groups in Illinois, Colorado, and New York to learn additional insights and to see if anything has changed given the increase in new arrivals in those states. So again, encourage you to join the campaign so you have access to those materials.
Thank you. And also, a lot of folks tend to forget that, especially when you look at it, the newcomer population, it's a really small percentage of the broader K-12 student population. And in general, our schools need more resources and to be able to fulfill both their moral, but also their legal obligations to serve all students. And so, immigrant students themselves make up like just around 2% of the entire K-12 population. So what we need is to support our schools at the end of the day so that they can support all of our children. There's one question that we got in the Q&A. I'm just going to provide an opportunity to make sure it's super clear for everyone. That was mentioned earlier that there was some relief as well as part of the announcements this week for DACA recipients. One clarification is that for the program that's specific to spouses of U.S. citizens, if there are DACA recipients that are potentially spouses of U.S. citizens, it may be a possibility for them to provide access more permanent relief that way. But then there's also the other program that Ignacia spoke to. So I'm just going to ask Ignacia to explain again the other initiative that may provide some relief for DACA recipients.
Yes, so we have to see the specific criteria, but based on what we know thus far, the Parole in Place program for spouses of U.S. citizens, a DACA recipient could be eligible for it. They may have already entered with inspection into the United States. They may have never accrued unlawful presence if they've had DACA since before they were 18. So there's a lot of technicalities involved, but let's say they are eligible, then that would help them be able to just do the process all within the United States without having to exit the United States. But again, we have to see the criteria, see if it's something that a DACA recipient or DACA eligible who's never actually received DACA would qualify for. And then with the employment-based announcement, there we have come across like DACA recipients that have employers that are willing to sponsor them for an employment-based visa. But the issue is that it's very hard to transition into an employment-based visa if you've been here unlawfully. So the idea, but again, we have to look at what gets rolled out, is that hopefully someone who has DACA is able to then benefit from the waivers to be able to access the program within the waivers within the United States. So then if they still have to leave the United States to finish the process, they don't have to leave for such a long period of time because they've already gotten that waiver approved within the United States. And that's what's commonly referred to as a D3 waiver. It's usually when people have accrued unlawful presence. So yeah, I mean, all dependent on what gets formally rolled out. Most of the announcements this week were just announcing that processes are being taken, and there's a lot of great minds thinking through the specifics, but it could benefit at least a subset of DACA eligible DACA recipients.
Thank you. And look at that, we actually used up our full time. So I'm going to wrap us up here. One question that I don't want people to think got ignored. There was a question in the Q&A box about have any organizations done work on contrasting the cost of investing in newcomer children and families with other key federal areas of investment? And are there any concerns about using this approach to shift the narrative? I don't know about any research being done here by these organizations, but we can follow up. I do know that there are a lot of research being done on this topic in general as we are preparing to defend the constitutional right to K-12 education. And I know one particular area of research that folks have been exploring is looking at what the potential cost to society would be if we were to lose this type of constitutional right, because obviously there's a lot of, there's obviously a lot of benefits and long term to our economy of educating all children, but also a lot of costs to us as a country if we don't. So, but I do appreciate that question and happy to follow up. So first and foremost, I just want to once again provide a deep thanks to our panelists for taking their time out of a very busy week to join us for this conversation and providing us with such rich information and also some tangible ways that people can take action in the months ahead. And also, thanks for reminding us that whether a child is an asylum seeker, an immigrant who's grown up here, or a U.S. citizen with an immigrant parent, the bottom line is that a child is a child, and every child deserves the protection and opportunity to achieve their full potential, especially here in the United States. So thanks again to the panel, and thanks again to all of you for your great questions. And Hannah, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Wendy. Wow, what a conversation. It definitely looks like there's going to be a lot to be watching out for in this next year. Right now, though, it's time to dive a little deeper into one of these issues. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We are very lucky to hear from Astu Chan. In this keynote segment, Astu is going to dive into the critical importance of prioritizing access to educational opportunities for immigrant students. With a dual perspective as both an educator and an impacted individual, Astu is going to share personal stories and professional insights that underscore the urgent need for protective measures such as DACA, permanent relief, and securement of K-12 educational access. Astu, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah. I appreciate that awesome introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Astu Chan. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at ImSchools. We are an immigrant-led national nonprofit working in New York City, working in New Jersey and Texas to ensure that K-12 schools are safe and welcoming spaces for all students, and especially immigrant students, regardless of their immigration status. So I'm really excited to be a part of this powerful conversation and to be in this space. I want to thank Children at Risk and the Children Thrive Action Network and partners for organizing this event and inviting me to share in this space. I think our summit comes at a really important time and with a really important objective, right? Which is to delve into the unique challenges that are impacting immigrant children, right? Immigrant children in our space, in our country, and to begin to think through how policy can be leveraged to improve these experiences. We want to champion education access for immigrant children, and that piece has been a through line so far and will be a through line for us in this summit. And so it feels important to share that I'm a formerly undocumented student and educator, and receiving an education changed my life, right? Full stop. And so today I want to share my educational journey as a student, but also as an educator, and just share some of the things that I've learned throughout my journey, and just really share kind of, and hopefully it'll convey the critical importance that adopting child-centered approaches and holistic approaches when it comes to supporting immigrant students has. So I'll be elevating some best practices in the end. I know that this is a space where we not only want to hear stories and hear experiences, but also like leave with tangible outcomes. So that's my hope, that you all will leave today with some of that. So for me, my story begins when I was 7 years old. Myself and my family immigrated to the US from Senegal, West Africa, and we settled in Harlem, New York City. For us, very early on, our identity as Francophone West Africans really shaped kind of our experience, right? Many people misinterpreted our limited English proficiency and my parents' limited English proficiency as a lack of agency, a lack of competency, and really just also with a tinge of a lack of humanity as well. And so for me, as a newcomer second grader, right, who did not speak English, I was supposed to be receiving language services, right? I did, but in Spanish. And this is important to note because it'll keep coming back. And I think somebody at the top of the summit shared how important it is to acknowledge the full diversity of the immigrant community, right? I was receiving languages services in Spanish when I was a French speaker, when I was a Wolof speaker. And so I remember being in those spaces and feeling really challenged because I didn't know what was happening. It was yet again another space where I was not able to meaningfully participate in my education. And one thing that I think that's really important to stamp there is, right, like knowing that this was a civil rights violation, right? My civil rights as a student to be able to be provided with access that would allow me to meaningfully participate in my education, it wasn't happening. And so despite these challenges, I was able to learn English by third grade. And by age 17, I was attending Brooklyn Technical High School, which is one of New York City's specialized high schools. I don't share that to flex, but I think it's really important for me to share with you all the name of the high school, just so you can know that it was one of the best high schools in the country, arguably, right? It was really at that point and at that place where I felt like my life was falling apart, right? At age 17 at Brooklyn Tech, while navigating the college application process, I learned that I was undocumented. And so I remember while my classmates talked about their dream schools and scholarships, I really had started to feel a level of turmoil and panic that really I had not felt at any other point in my life up until then. I decided to muster up the courage to go to a counselor to ask to be directed to where all the scholarships were for the kids who didn't have a social security number, right? And a high school counselor at my school told me very bluntly, very definitively, you can't go to college. And in that moment, she redefined what I believed was possible for me in my life. And at that moment, I wish I knew, right? But, Forward.us estimates that about 100,000 undocumented young people graduate high school every year. And so despite this number being pretty significant, in the moment, as a 17-year-old who basically, I was receiving the information as if my life was over, my future was over, I really felt very isolated and singled out. The few scholarships that I was able to find and research for people who are undocumented were open to people from a Latinx background or people from a Central American background, which contributed to my sense of isolation. Thankfully, that woman was wrong. But like the impact of her words in that moment was basically within a month, I had been forced to move to a new city. And I was to be a hair braider at one of my aunt's African hair braiding shops. And I think as a 17-year-old, accepting that new life was very difficult for me. The West African hair braiding industry is one that includes difficult manual labor, right? It had sustained many of my West African aunties who were also without options, but it was not the life that I felt like I worked for, that I envisioned for myself. And so coming to terms with it was difficult. And so one day, I don't know if it was divine intervention or what, but I was scrolling through Facebook and saw the different posts from my peers about their new dorms and their new colleges and complaining about already having homework. And I decided to give college one last shot, right? So I called the financial aid office at Hunter College, and that conversation changed my life again. This time I encountered an educator who was very chipper. She probably sounded like an angel to me at the time. And she said, sure, you can still come. Hunter College was still an option for me. And because it was one of the CUNYs within the CUNY system of New York, it was really, really affordable, or more affordable than any other college opportunity that I had. And so within 2 weeks, I was enrolled in Hunter College, right? And that was, again, another turning point because that year as a college student, I think I was 19 years old, the DACA program had been announced. I had applied and began working 35 hours a week as a retail worker to fund my own education, right? To make sure my payment plan payments went through on time to be able to pay my way through college. And so being cognizant of that journey, right? And being cognizant of how really up until that point, I was really lucky, right? To be connected to someone who made this a reality for me. As a senior, by the time senior year came around in college, I decided I wanted to be an educator. I was really excited to become the type of educator that could be a connector and a resource. And the type of educator that I desperately needed when I was 17 years old in that guidance counselor's office. And so I did. I was able to apply to Teach for America, which at the time and still does accepts DACA recipients. And I was able to serve in my community and serve in the community that I grew up in Harlem. I taught middle school English for 5 years in New York City, starting in Harlem, moved to the Bronx, and then ended up in Brooklyn. And then in my 6th year in education, I became an assistant principal of a school with a lot of Black immigrant students in Canarsie, Brooklyn. And I happened to be a DACA recipient, right? And so that allowed me the unique lens, and also with my experience, my early experience in schools, just knowing that immigrant students and newcomer students and English language learner students are supposed to be receiving services, language services. Their parents are supposed to be receiving language services, but that didn't really match what I was seeing in schools. Across the 3 schools where I worked in New York City, and again, it's important because New York City is perceived as kind of leading the charge in this space, right? Out of the 3 schools that I taught in New York City, only one provided language services to students who were English language learners. And so I was really struck to see that this was the same scene or a similar scene from what I had experienced as a newcomer student 20 years prior. And so that inspired my pivot into education policy. So many years after that, I'm here in front of you all as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at M Schools, where I collaborate with many of you on this call, but many advocates to push for policies that expand access to immigrant students, regardless of their status or regardless of their parent status. And so, you know, when I reflect about this work that I have the privilege to do, I think, and my journey, I think there's been a lot of privilege for me. I am here because, yes, like I worked hard, but I think it has a lot to do with luck too, right? I'm in this space, in this moment, because I was lucky. I was lucky to get the inspiration to try a college just to see if they would take me in late August when many colleges had started the fall semester, and to encounter a lovely woman who breathed life into me and breathed optimism into me that had been taken away. I was lucky to live in a state with a CUNY system, right, where the tuition was cheap enough for me to afford through the salary of a part-time retail worker. I was lucky to have been eligible for DACA, right? A reality that I think is really important because today, the majority of the young people who are in high schools, who are in schools, are not eligible for the DACA program and won't be. And I was lucky to have a best friend who, you know, shared with me that Teach for America was looking for teachers, and also they accepted DACA recipients. And so, you know, I come back to luck all the time. It was not an easy path, but I think luck keeps coming up for me. And I think young people deserve better than luck, right? I think they deserve better than work hard, and if you get lucky, your life, you might have the tools necessary to self-actualize and to create a better life for yourself and your family. And so I think my call to action in this space, and I know I'm among friends and I'm speaking to a lot of advocates and practitioners, is to just remind folks that you do play a critical role in influencing what young people imagine is possible for their life, or what is even possible for young people. And so with that in mind, I think it's really important to adopt the following practices. These are kind of just stamping the things that I think are helpful based on kind of the journey that you've just heard. The first thing is to just ensure that immigrant students have meaningful access to the good education. I work at this weird intersection between education and immigration. And I find that when I'm in immigration spaces, not many people talk about or want to get into like kind of the implications of being a child of immigrants or being a young immigrant in the K-12 space. And then when I'm in education spaces, not enough acknowledgement or work is being done in thinking about, okay, what about immigration status in K-12 education? What about a parent being undocumented, and how does that shape and influence the opportunities that a young person is able to have or not able to have? And so I think it's important for both worlds to begin to speak a little bit more, right? And since I'm in front of advocates today, I think it's really important to hone in on that meaningful access to education, right? So it's not enough to like work with let's say an accompanied minor, and you're working with them and getting them kind of the support that they need, whether that's health, right, status adjustment help, getting them to the schoolhouse. But in addition to getting them to the schoolhouse, it's really important to peek into the schoolhouse a little bit and see what's going on, right? I think it's important as advocates to visit schools and check in with teachers and school staff and school leaders around language services. Are they being offered? Are the classrooms safe and welcoming for students despite their status? What is the school's plan for engaging with immigrant families who may or may not speak English, right? I think as advocates, we really have to kind of lean in a little bit more in that space. And it's totally within our right to do it. Because again, the goal is to not say, okay, you're in the school, check. Really, it's all about the quality of education our immigrant origin students are experiencing in schools that can really have profound influences on their trajectory. The second kind of piece is around supporting and championing the creation of safe and welcoming schools. And again, I feel like in the advocacy and policy space, I meet people who often shy away from that because they feel like you have to be an educator or you have to be in schools to champion things that are happening in schools. And I think that that's not necessarily true, right? We know what the gaps are, and we have an eye into the language gaps, the challenges that come up when status is an issue. And so there's a lot that we can leverage in terms of experiences and stories directly to school leaders and school staff, right? To move the needle. It's really important also that we take the time to be educated about all the different policies that impact our immigrant students, right? And really living out the full diversity of what it means to be an immigrant in this space, right? And so what that looks like is knowing that this is not only a Latinx issue, right? That this impacts Black immigrants in very specific ways, right? I don't have to share here or go too much into detail around how much more enforcement Black immigrants experience compared to other groups, right? It's important to acknowledge and think about how this issue intersects with folks from an AAPI background, right? That's also another community in the immigrant space that is pretty invisible or made to be invisible. And so really just championing the issue with school leaders, with local school districts at the state level is really important, and doing so while centering the full diversity of the entire immigrant community is really important. And then finally, I would say it's important to start at least exploring or building a capacity to respond through a policy or an advocacy lens when we see things not happening in schools that should be happening in schools, right? As an educator, I think I'm always like one of the last people to knock if I don't see something happening in schools. My instinct is to ask, is there adequate funding? Do educators have the tools that they need to make something happen? And so if the answer is no, which often it is, right? I think it's our job as advocates to champion the funding pieces around to ensure that our students get what they need in schools, right? We should be championing Title III funding. We should be championing more funding, but also a higher quality of instruction for English language learners and newcomer students. And so begin to think about and build your capacity to do that, right? Maybe it's not a part of your agenda or it's not a part of your day-to-day, but it definitely plays a role in the experiences that immigrant children have in schools. And finally, get involved with accountability measures for schools and providers who are not providing these services. This can be done on the district level. This can be done on the state level. This can be done on the federal level, right? For folks here whose work mainly revolves around the federal area, you should be very familiar with the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. Right? That is an institution that we can use to raise the standard for what services our immigrant students are not getting, right? There's literally a number that you can call to file a complaint with OCR. And so I will wrap by again, thanking everyone for being in this space and being in this work to ensure that every child has the opportunity to succeed regardless of their immigration status, regardless of the immigration status of their families. And this work definitely starts with us today. And so I'm hopeful that through hearing my story, through hearing about the best practices I've uplifted, you re-enter this work or continue this work feeling invigorated, and knowing that there are folks like CTAN, there are folks at Children at Risk, there are folks at M-Schools who are eager to engage and partner with you all. So I will stop there and take a peek at this Q&A function to see if any questions came through. Okay, Hannah, do you see any? I don't see any, but I want to make sure.
I see one here. I think we can follow up, or you can follow up by typing it in on the resources aspect of it. But thank you so much, Astu. That was so powerful. Thank you for sharing your experiences and all of your insights, and obviously your dedication to creating a more inclusive and equitable educational landscape. So thank you so much for that. So switching gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about federal policy today, but a lot of important things are happening simultaneously at the state level. So now we are very excited to have a discussion on how states are addressing the evolving needs of immigrant families amidst increased migration flows. Our expert panelists here today will share insights and lessons from states that have faced significant migration shifts in the last few years at the U.S.-Mexico border. This panel is going to explore how state advocacy and communities are responding to newcomer needs. I'm so excited to introduce Linda Corchado, who will moderate this discussion today. Linda is the Senior Director of Immigration at Children at Risk. Joining her is Susan Reed, Director at the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, Lijah Schwartzwald, Director of Economic Justice and Empowerment at the New York Immigration Coalition, Andrea Kovac, Health Justice Attorney at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, and Louise L. Yafouri, Owner and Lead Consultant of Diversified Consulting. So Linda, I'll pass to you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you to Astu. That was such a great speech and reminders for all of us that are entrenched in doing this really important work. I'm hoping all of my panelists can join me on camera. That's Andrea, Susan, and Louise. If you could turn on your cameras. Thank you. So thank you to all our speakers for joining us today. This panel is jam-packed We are covering ground in Michigan, Illinois, New York, and Denver and Colorado. But first, I'm starting with Texas. Leading up to Biden's executive actions this week, remarkably, the one person making the most impact on immigrant families was not our president, was not Congress or the Department of Homeland Security. It was Texas Governor Abbott, who since the launch of Operation Lone Star here in Texas has bused more than 100,000 families and asylum seekers from Texas to states across the United States. This transportation is uncoordinated with such little regard for the well-being of children, and their lives are further destabilized by these politics under situations where they will likely face homelessness, poverty, hunger, and fear. What began as Texas's political statement on border policy has turned into politics that are endangering and destabilizing the lives of children. Today, we are hearing from key states who have been receiving and welcoming immigrant families, the politics they straddle, and their efforts to fight for all families in America to receive health care and have unencumbered access to public education. With the election year in full swing, there is the uncertainty of who will be at the helm at the White House and Congress. What is clear, however, is the need for advocates to join forces, to explore ways to disarm the politics that harm immigrant children. Sometimes that means learning from heartbreak, and other times it's celebrating those big wins together. What makes this work challenging is that domestic policies across the country really do create a patchwork of approaches that harm some immigrant students, others that provide more safety, while there may be other opportunities even then yet untapped. That's why I'm so thrilled to be joined by our panelists today. So Susan, I'll start with you. The recent elimination of the 5-year wait for Medicaid and CHIP in Michigan's fiscal year 2024 budget is expected to impact about 4,000 children and thousands of pregnant persons. Susan, lead us up to this moment. What level of collaboration and advocacy had to take place to bring about this victory?
Thank you so much, Linda. You know, in terms of the collaboration, I'm honored to be on this panel. My colleague Simon Marshall Shaw from the Michigan League for Public Policy had also planned to join you. And certainly our work with the Michigan League for Public Policy, our work as an immigrant rights organization and an immigration legal services provider in collaboration with the Michigan League, who really focus on a broader agenda around human services access in Lansing, our capital, has been critical on so many policies, and this is a great example. To go back in time in invitation to your question, in response to your invitation to kind of do so, I will always feel like this took longer than it should have. And it really started about 15 years ago when our project, the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, started. We had a new Republican governor at that time, Rick Snyder. He later became very well known, I'm sure, to many of your attendees around the Flint water crisis. But when he first came into office, he had a kind of pragmatic pro-immigrant agenda, very focused on legal immigrants. And I thought, oh, well, this might be a very appealing policy. He created a state New Americans office. It's called the Office of Global Michigan. And right away, I started engaging with that office about this policy and how I thought it really aligned with Governor Snyder's kind of moderate and certainly desire to be seen as moderate on this issue. And they were very supportive. The staff of that office, they agreed that this seemed like the perfect opportunity for Governor Snyder to show that, he had not only kind of a immigration and economic development agenda, but a broader interest in supporting working class or lower income immigrants. Unfortunately, his desire to position himself that way on immigration was really out of line with the rest of his party, who had control of our legislature at that time. And so, it became pretty clear we needed an appropriation and that was not going to come. When our Democratic governor came in with Republican legislative control, we continued to have that problem, right? There was some interest in the policy. Again, it's the Immigrant Children's Health Improvement Act, or ICHIA expansion. A lot of great material out there. There was interest in it, but there was not a sense an appropriation could come through. When a sort of Democratic trifecta came in, it was definitely one we put it on our list as like a extremely high priority. And we started thinking beyond. This is honestly the kind of issue that a lot of immigrant rights organizations maybe find to be too in the weeds. We're lawyers and we love stuff, and we're legal aid lawyers, so we really care about public benefits access. It's a niche thing, right? And this is a complicated, kind of subset of people who are eligible. And so we didn't necessarily have the most luck engaging like our organizing groups that we work with, just because it affects a relatively small number of people. Although, again, getting better health insurance for 4,000 people, if I never do anything else in my career, I'll feel like I can be proud. It just didn't quite have the profile of like, it's just hard to organize around it at the grassroots level. And so we started talking with colleagues that do more public benefits organizing. We connected with the Washtenaw Health Plan, which is the county Ann Arbor, Michigan is located in, has kind of like a healthcare plan of last resort. Anyone who can't get coverage through other public or private programs can potentially be eligible for the Washtenaw Health Plan. So they had a lot of knowledge and expertise for non-covered and undercovered immigrant populations. We connected very closely with our partners at the Michigan Elder Justice Initiative. And we did that because they have such good relationships with our Department of Health and Human Services. We also had students at Michigan Medicine, the University of Michigan Medical School, who were very interested in advocacy. And that's actually been fruitful on a number of immigrant health access things we've worked on. There are always medical and public health students who are really interested, and they will research for you, and their professors have contacts. This panel is not about this, but we had a great outcome on getting dialysis covered by emergency Medicaid with Michigan medicine students and their nephrology professors. And so that collaboration, not just immigrant rights organizations, but thinking more broadly about how to offer kind of public health, public policy partners the opportunity to do something for immigrant communities worked really well, because it got us engaged with our State Department of Health and Human Services. And as it turned out, right, they administer the state Medicaid plan. They are in a budget process that is, I think, much more robust than maybe the Office of Global Michigan folks are. Obviously, the DHHS budget is much, much bigger and a much more complicated process than the New Americans Office, right? And so once we got buy-in from the Department of Health and Human Services and the governor's office, we were able to get it into the governor's budget, and it went through the legislature, and it starts in August.
Right. I mean, such a great pathway that you're showing us, taking such a niche topic, right, that relatively many would think doesn't impact as many persons living in, but in actuality it has a huge impact on those that it does. And the perseverance, right, to just stick through it as the chessboard keeps changing, but stick to the script and the larger goals. So that's really encouraging. Now that you see this coming to fruition, what are those projected economic and social benefits of this policy for immigrant communities and the state as a whole?
Yeah, well, I mean, we looked at and, certainly shared with our partners the way that taking this option, the ACHIA option, would improve financial stability and healthcare access. The states that have done this have seen increased stability for families through low premiums and limited out-of-pocket spending. States that extended Medicaid and CHIP coverage to lawfully residing children by 2011 saw a nearly 14% decrease in the probability of immigrant children experiencing any unmet need, and while also improving access to preventive care. So we really, we know that obviously having kids be underinsured just really destabilizes families. And so we're very excited as well about Michigan is a big receiving state for unaccompanied children being resettled through ORR's unaccompanied minors programs. And we at Merck represent all of those kids with regard to their immigration and custody status. And we just know this is anecdotal more than broad economic impact, but so many of them face that 5-year waiting period as young adults. And they're not really in the position to engage with marketplace coverage if there's any kind of premium they have to pay. I mean, imagine any foster child aging into adulthood, and then imagine the overwhelming burden of not even qualifying for Medicaid and having to come up with marketplace premiums. So we're especially excited about the pocketbook impact for our kids who are aging out of federal custody, usually with status, but previously not with healthcare. They will be covered as lawfully residing.
I wonder, for other states looking at what's going on in Michigan now, is there a learning lesson you'd like to share, or something helpful that really helped advocates kind of stay the course and be successful here?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that lesson of, looking less at immigrant rights orgs on this. Obviously, that's a great way to identify priorities, but really connecting with healthcare advocacy groups to make it happen was a big lesson. Another lesson is that we did this pretty quietly. Obviously, we're all out there like banging on pots and pans about how we want our driver's licenses, but and how we need immigration reform now. But this was a good one to do quietly. And I'm so excited about it happening, and I'm excited to be able to share it in this room because we have, unfortunately, and this is a lesson learned, seen a few pro-immigrant things that our administration has done in the state kind of get heavily politicized when they've received a lot of press. There was a recent housing assistance program that really some press on it really seemed to shake the governor's office pretty greatly. We're seeing anti-immigrant sentiment have an impact on the policy work we're doing at all levels, state for sure. And so I do think that it's a good time right now to look at things like this that you can do somewhat quietly. And then keep your celebration. Certainly, you don't have to hide your light under a basket, but I think keeping your celebration about this kind of win in the family a little bit, I would highly recommend.
Okay. That's so helpful. Susan, thank you for sharing those perspectives. From Michigan, we pivot to heartbreak in Illinois, it seems like. Illinois is moving a different direction from Michigan, now ending Illinois state health insurance coverage for non-citizen green card holders and migrants who've been in the U.S. for less than 5 years. Andrea, what factors led to this loss for immigrant families?
Thank you. Yes, I am going to get to the answer to your question, but I did want to provide kind of a zoom out or just larger context before I get to that answer. Because Illinois actually does have a long history of wisely extending health coverage to its residents, regardless of immigration status. which our state should really be proud of, and which I hope we can reclaim that. So Illinois was the first state to provide Medicaid coverage to all children, regardless of immigration status, which is still in effect. And in 2018, Illinois launched a medical cash and nutrition assistance program called VTTC for people who are preparing to file or have filed an application for asylum, trafficking visa, or a U visa. And this program has been a lifeline to the over 43,000 new arrivals whom Illinois has welcomed to our state, most from Texas, just since August of 2022. And Illinois also provides Medicaid coverage to all pregnant people, regardless of immigration status. We were the first state to provide coverage for 1 year after the pregnancy has ended. And then getting to the programs that the green card holders that you mentioned were actually enrolled in. Illinois was the first state to provide health coverage to undocumented seniors, really any senior who has an immigration status that made them ineligible for federal Medicaid. And this program, Health Benefit for Immigrant Seniors Program, or HBIS, this launched in December 2020, which, as we all know, was still the height of the pandemic. And then in the following 2 years, Illinois created a similar program, again, for adults who have an immigration status that makes them ineligible for federal Medicaid, and that's called Health Benefit for Immigrant Adults. And here's where we get into the partial answer to your question. So the Illinois General Assembly authorized a funding amount for these programs sufficient only to cover for HBIA adults age 42 to 64. The Healthy Illinois campaign, which the Shriver Center where I work has been providing policy support to for over a decade and has been the lead coalition for these expansions. Healthy Illinois campaign has consistently advocated for the HBIA program to start at age 19, but it's stuck at age 42. So it's these HBIA and HBIS programs where the green card holders who are still in their 5-year wait period have recently, just this past spring, been excluded and by the state, by the governor's office, by the Medicaid agency to, quote, bring the cost of these programs in line with the budget allocation. So the costs for HBIA and HBIS were higher than original budget allocation amounts because, and I'm sure this will sound familiar to advocates from other states that are working on this area, because initially there was a significant undercount of the projected eligible populations for these programs, plus an unprecedented take-up rate of the programs, which were basically over 100% take-up rates given that significant undercount. And then the third factor was higher initial medical costs for the enrollees, like vis-a-vis someone who's enrolled in federal Medicaid, because if you think about it, people who are undocumented or are green card holders who've had that status less than 5 years, they haven't had access to comprehensive affordable health insurance coverage. So they are going to have so many unmet, untreated medical needs. That means that the cost of their care is going to be higher initially. So if you put all of those together, the significant undercount of the eligible population, the unprecedented take-up rate, and the higher initial medical costs, yes, there was a high cost of the programs vis-a-vis what the General Assembly and the governor's office put in their budget allocation. So instead of allocating sufficient funding to these programs, which would make economic sense, that's when the state closed the programs for new enrollment, imposed cost sharing, and then they also used rulemaking to exclude the green card holders in their 5-year wait period. So Illinois is regrettably, at least in this instance, moving in a different direction than other states, but we are continuing to advocate strongly to reopen and restore these programs.
And how are those efforts going for you right now? You know, I'm sure there's this moment where you kind of need to rebound and regather and see what you need to think of in terms of strategy moving forward. One, and two, I'm sure you need a strong information campaign for so many immigrant families looking at the news, wondering how this is going to impact them.
Yeah, we haven't taken a breath. The Shriver Center, where I work, has really strong partnerships with immigrant serving organizations, advocates locally and nationally, really strong partnerships with enrollment assisters and navigators. And we've been working all spring to try to help these green card holders seamlessly transition to marketplace coverage to qualify for the federal financial help, because most of them do, because they're low income, and to do it without any sort of coverage disruption for them or lose their trusted healthcare providers. So we've been trying to connect them with navigators who speak their language and understand their culture, but there unfortunately is a very small supply of these navigators relative to the need. We've been partnering with immigrant serving organizations on doing Facebook Lives. We've held webinars, convened meetings where we've shared information about this particular population in Spanish and in English. And there have been just so many nuanced issues to work through. So like in one of many examples, seniors who might be living with their adult children, they will have different tax rules apply to them. So we've done information sharing just on that issue, for instance. We've also advocated with the state Medicaid agency, who is the one that initiated this change in the first place, for them to send multiple notices in the top languages spoken by the population about how they would qualify for a special enrollment period, how they could find a free navigator. And then at the same time, the state also has launched redeterminations of HBIA and HBIS, these immigrant Medicaid-like programs. So that has been very challenging. And we've been working with immigrant serving organizations to provide outreach and education on the redetermination process, because both of those programs I mentioned earlier, HBIA and HBIS, were created and launched during the pandemic, which, as everyone remembers, that's when redeterminations were paused for everyone. So in addition to having language barriers, these enrollees have never had an annual review of their eligibility before. So this is a new concept to them. So that work is also ongoing as we speak. So we are just plowing ahead and very thankful for our partnerships.
Thank you for sharing those perspectives and the nuances behind this change, right? I think that's really important for immigrant families everywhere to understand. So thank you so much for those perspectives, Andrea. Pivoting to public education, Liza, according to officials in New York City, the city has gained over 30,000 migrant students since the spring of 2022. What policies would you like to see more of to ensure that immigrant children receive the necessary support and resources in the public school system?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So yeah, I'll do a little context setting too, right? So it's been about, I think we're at about 33,000 now in terms of the students who were enrolled until the end of this particular school year. New York city has seen overall, I think over almost 200,000 or a little over 200,000 people coming through, many of whom do not stay in New York City, but who've, been bussed up or who've come here and then gone other places, and then many of whom have stayed. Including this 33,000 students. So I think the first thing to know, and what's really important to know about New York City, is that we do have a right to shelter, but that right has been challenged multiple times since this situation began back in June of 2022. What that meant is while our initial, kind of first year or so of families coming in, that often meant that the kids were in the shelter, but they were going to stay in the same shelter. They were going to, meet potentially an enrollment coordinator at that shelter. They were going to get enrolled in a school that was as close as possible to the shelter they were in. And then they were, intended to be served the same as any other student in temporary housing with those, associated protections. However, back in fall of this past year, so fall of 2023, our mayor, with unfortunately governmental support, was, moving to actually get rid of the right to shelter altogether, functionally say, like, this was a court order and not like a piece of legislation, and we want you to overturn it. And there was a real chance that could have happened. Like there was some support around this. It was not something that was very publicly popular in New York City. New Yorkers, by and large, really like the right to shelter. For a number of reasons. But this was really damaging. And what ended up happening as a result is that there was, a settlement for single adults. And the city moved, instead of getting rid of the right to shelter altogether, they started moving into the situation where we were actually doing reticketing. And for families, this is very relevant because what happened was parents with school-aged children started being made to move from shelter to shelter every 60 days. So obviously the complications that ensue from that shuffling, this like kind of really like awful musical chairs situation, where every 60 days, families have a choice to either try to get out of the shelter. Often they can't. That's why they're there to begin with. And then also to have to then figure out how to get to the school that they had just applied to or had just enrolled in. And so what happened there, forgive me, my cat is very chatty, so I'm just going to put these to keep going. Is my sound okay? All right, perfect. So what happened was a lot of these students ended up getting shifted from shelter to shelter and were then not able to keep attending the school that they were going to, or were having gaps of weeks to months if they were younger while the transportation was figured out. Some of them weren't getting Metro cards who were supposed to. We know that there were over 1,000 students who we could confirm actually that this happened to over the last year. So one of the biggest changes, although it isn't in the school system itself, is that families need to not be restricted in terms of their shelter time. They ought to be able to stay until they are able to leave. They shouldn't be shifted around. That has a big cost to the city. When it comes to the Department of Transportation, having to then figure out how to get kids from now sometimes an hour away to the school that they used to be a walking distance away from. All of the shuffling that we had to do of teachers, bilingual teachers, English, as a new language programs, all of these supports get messed up every time students have to move because a lot of them then have to transfer or they can't get to the school that they were at. And that's caused just so much uncertainty for so many families that it's actually some of the families that come in now don't bother to enroll if they don't think that they can stay in a particular place. So the first thing we have to do is really get rid of that restriction. I think once kids are in schools, there's like a whole different set of, of things that we need to work on. New York, like many others, and I think another speaker is going to talk about bilingual teacher shortages, but we have those as well. We've pushed on the state level actually for a bilingual teacher pipeline that would really take some kids from actually Queens, which is I think the most diverse county, might even be the most diverse county in the nation, but certainly in New York. And really help kids who are bilingual get their certifications, be covered for some of these pieces and build up the infrastructure. Because this kind of migration isn't actually new for New York City. We are constantly, integrating immigrant and English language learner children into the city without the big ripple effects that this has. This has been a very large political situation, and I think it's gotten capitalized quite a lot on the national level. But as a reality for New York City, almost half of our students are immigrant students. And that has been the case for a long time. I think it's like 40% or a little over 40% of kids have at least one immigrant parent in New York City. So this is a huge population for us, and any infrastructure we build that supports asylum seeker students is naturally also going to be a much better situation
for our longer term immigrant students who are also here and also often learning and struggling to learn English and all of these other pieces. I'll shout out 2 programs quickly that we are working on in the K through 12 level, and then I'll stop talking. So the first is a project, and I'm not sure how kind of familiar with transfer schools folks are here, but New York City has programs called transfer schools that are models that are actually explicitly intended for students with interrupted formal education, or what we call SIFE students. And this is students who, have missed days, weeks, years of schooling for a number of reasons. Often our asylum seekers are these students. They're usually a little bit older, 16 to 21, and have, through no fault of their own, not been able to to have earned enough credits to actually, graduate on time. So within the transfer school model, there are actually 6 English language learner specific transfer schools. And those schools have like incredible supports. One of them even has night classes for the teenagers who need to work during the day, but they are culturally competent. They have language supports. They have English language supports. The classes themselves are really integrated into the understanding of what language learning means, and also, really aware of the fact that many of these teens who need these kinds of supports also need to work, also have traumas and mental health issues that they've been dealing with, also often have post-traumatic stress disorder, and other other of these kinds of traumas that they have carried with them here. And that it's really the job of schools and students to actually, get those supports in that space. So English language learner transfer schools are phenomenal programs. We were able to expand some of those last year to an additional 6 schools. So they weren't fully fledged programs, but we really were able to take some of the lessons from those English language learner transfer schools and move them into 6 additional schools that were outside of Manhattan. And then finally, there was a project that is a little bit of a newer project for us at the NYIC that we've been supporting called Project Soaring. So one of the things that has happened here is that a lot of the shelters that kids and families were initially brought to were in Manhattan, but often the demographics of schools got shifted pretty substantially because those were not necessarily schools that served a huge amount of immigrant students before, right? Like if you were in the Upper West Side, that may not have been a place where you were seeing 30, 40, 50 English language learners, but because a shelter opened up near that school, suddenly these schools got this this big boost in enrollment from this particular kind of student, and sort of had to figure out how to best serve them. And so what Project Soaring is, it's a program that would take lessons that we've learned from the International Schools Network and some of the better programs that we've seen serving English language learners. And it actually provides leadership development for the 10 schools that have accepted the most students in the last couple of years, so that they can really be best served to do the work that they need to do. And again, this all goes back to the fact that these programs, these supports are great for kids no matter what, right? They are not just good for asylum seeker students. They are also great for the kids who are already here and have been here. They're good for our English language learners who have, been on the path for a while and need to get closer to the graduation and all of these other pieces. So yeah, those are a few of the programs that we've been looking at.
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful because a lot of this, and we got that messaging too from our federal panel, is all of that focus on a strain of resources, right? And how are you pivoting through all of the language, and a house hearing was also inspired by what is happening in New York City schools, right? But to hear from you instead, solid examples that are working and are changing the lives of kids. I mean, Luis, that's what you're doing in Colorado too, right? Like when there's all of this noise, but at the end of the day, you've got to get your work done. You've got to ensure that kids have access to education. Thank you, Liza. And going to Colorado now, this is a state that has enrolled 6,000 new migrant students this last school year. How are school districts managing that resource drain, right, in general? There's an increased demand now for interpreters, for bilingual teachers and aides. What innovative strategies have been working for you all in Colorado?
Linda, thanks so much for highlighting the influx to Colorado. Yes, Diversified supports a range of organizations working on strategic integration solutions, but we are rooted in education. That's our base. And we have sort of this advantage in that we work with schools across the nation and internationally. So we've got sort of an eagle's view of what's working and what's not. But if we bring that back to Colorado, let's set the context here a little bit too. First is that here in Colorado, while that number seems large, it's important to remember that we're also still integrating and welcoming other populations as well. So we still have other more traditionally ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement folks that are being integrated into our communities as well. Also, this is not our first time here. We've been here before. Colorado has a long history of welcoming. And while we tend to think of the Denver metro as being that space because Denver is considered a welcoming city, we can't leave out our folks in Northern Colorado, our more rural communities on the Western slope. So this is really a statewide commitment. The other important thing here is that if we're looking at this from sort of a funnel down approach, starting at sort of the state level, we have folks in our government offices, CDHS, unaccompanied refugee minors, CRISP, our Colorado Refugee Services Program, our city departments who are readily accessible and approachable and have been working really in a solid ways for the last 12 years to make sure that we have ways to break down silos, to build connections. And so, for example, we have a statewide listserv that allows us to exchange ideas and resources. And we also meet biannually where folks in the school-based setting, if you are a school-based practitioner, you can come to that meeting and engage with folks from refugee resettlement organizations, from transportation teams, from food security folks, with health teams, with legal aids, so that when we have families in our school settings, we know the right teams to call. We can connect families to the right spaces and places that they need in that moment. So those are really important pieces that kind of funnel down. If we look at really the demand for bilingual, that still is helpful because when we have that really robust network and community, we're in conversation with each other all the time. So our teams that are doing our English language programs, they have referrals. They say, this person is going, I think they're going to be ready to take the translation test, so then they can refer on. Our team at Diversified is 100%, we're all recent or former newcomers. So what that means is that when I see a school district that has a need, I can say, I have a person that's perfect for this. So half of our staff is now also contracted as either a navigator or a paraprofessional in a classroom, because we collectively recognize not only the need, we recognize the incredible value that these folks bring into the classrooms, right? And we're willing to share both the load and the resources. So one, having that ability to connect and that pipeline of continuously sharing information with one another. The other part of that is that those state organizations are really committed to redirecting funding into schools in order to support that. So where we typically think of schools being funded for paraprofessionals and aides coming through the Department of Education, maybe a grant to a nonprofit, we have CDHS, URM, CRISP, eyeballing, saying this is a need. Anything that we can redirect to help support humans in those positions, they're finding pathways to do that. And then if we kind of transition to what's happening in schools and districts, there are a couple really promising practices that are worthwhile to point out. One example, Montview Elementary and Aurora Public Schools is perhaps one of the most exciting and really just on target version of a community school model that I've had the pleasure of visiting. And with that community school model, they're really growing leaders from within the community. And this particular community was heavily impacted. So the folks that are engaged there are predominantly Venezuelan, Colombian. They're growing those folks from within. They're finding out what those parents want and need, finding support to transition from coming to a meeting to then volunteering in the classroom to becoming an aide in the classroom and being integrated in other ways. DPS, or Denver Public Schools, takes that a step further. They have very well thought out para to teacher pathways. A paraprofessional can be working as a paraprofessional, and they specifically attract bilingual paraprofessionals while that individual is in the paraprofessional setting, they're also taking classes alongside so they can transition to the professional licensure. So those folks are moving on. It's attractive for folks coming in because they see a pathway. And interestingly, those folks who have gone from the paraprofessional to the teacher pathway tend to have a lower turnover rate, a higher retention rate. So there's a lot of advantage and sustainability to that path too. And then I'll also point out districts like Cherry Creek Public Schools that have really strong cultural liaison teams. And those teams are not just utilized in the classroom. They can be, but they're also utilized in the community. They partner with other folks and other programming. McKinney-Vento, which is our homeless and houseless populations, student populations, those folks can then navigate into the communities. And again, in just having those more robust conversations, being on the ground, like in Montview, we are growing and attracting folks with lived cultural experience. And this is really important when we talk about our migrant populations, because most of the Spanish-speaking bilingual staff members that we have are not necessarily from the countries that we're servicing. So making sure that we have folks with lived cultural reference points from those communities, with dialects from those communities. So that commitment to hiring from within the services of communities is one common thread that I would say throughout any successful school or school district in Colorado. That would be the one common thread, is that we're actively recruiting and finding ways to propel growth, to make those attractive and create sustainability from folks with lived cultural and language experience.
Such wonderful, shining examples. Thank you so much, Louise. Y'all, I had so much fun in this panel. Thank you to our panelists. And thanks everyone for joining us. Back to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to close out here. Thank you all the panelists for joining us today and helping us understand what this fight is going to look like in this upcoming year. And yes, it does seem like it's going to be an uphill battle. We're going to face a lot of challenges as we work together in coalition, but there are also opportunities, and the challenges don't change what we know and what we're going to keep saying over and over and over again, that there is no scarcity of resources. With proper planning and proper allocation, we can welcome newcomers and expand avenues of prosperity for everyone. We can pursue those common sense, humane policy solutions like the ones mentioned today that fund states and localities, expand legal pathways to status, and modernize our immigration system. We can invest in children's potential and remove barriers to their opportunity that undermine their success, as long as we choose to prioritize it. So what's next? To continue engaging in this conversation and our work, please check us out on social media for more events and resources. And one final thank you goes out to our audience for being with us here today for this important conversation. We encourage you to get in touch with any questions or collaboration opportunities. Again, we will share the slide deck and link to the recording in an email to all registrants by tomorrow afternoon. And if you thought today's programming was particularly impactful, I encourage you to register for upcoming events such as the Children at Risk's Education Summit on Thursday, August 8th. We also welcome you to join the Children Thrive Action Network. The sign-up form is going to be dropped in the chat. And before we close out, I have one final request. We encourage you to just take a moment to share your feedback on today's event with us by using the QR code on your screen or the link shared in the chat. And I'll just give a few moments for folks to grab the links. But thank you all so much and have a great rest of your afternoon.